Widowed millionaire found Nanny asleep with his twins on his bed. No one dared to touch. He took
What is
unexpected
this?
action. Hi, my most beautiful family. Let's begin with a short but powerful prayer. Dear God, thank you for this loving family. Heal me fully and bless everyone watching with peace, health, and endless joy. Amen. This is your Mr. Peter. While I was resting, your love carried me. You're not subscribers. You're my family, my strength, my reason to keep going. To every new family member, welcome home. Please share in the comments. How did you find us? Which story touched your heart? Your voice matters here. And here's the good news. I'll be back today. By God's grace, I'm returning with love and more stories made just for you. If you see my videos elsewhere, they're stolen. This is the only real Mr. Peter channel. Let's protect it. Before we begin, one small request. Please like, comment, and don't skip the story. If the intro feels long, skip it, but stay for the heart of the story. James is here to share today's tale, and I'll see you again, today, with love.
Tom Conway had built his fortune on the absolute certainty that he was smarter, tougher, and more ruthless than anyone who dared challenge him. But nothing in his arrogant, perfectly controlled world could have prepared him for the sight that stopped him cold in his own forbidden bedroom doorway. The late afternoon Virginia sun streamed through the tall windows of his master bedroom, a room he'd avoided living in for 2 years, entering only when absolutely necessary to retrieve documents or check that everything remained as Eleonora had left it when cancer claimed her in that very bed. The silk curtains still hung exactly as she'd arranged them, the antique vanity still held her silver brush set, and the air still carried the faintest whisper of her jasmine perfume. It was a shrine to a love that death had stolen too soon. But today something had changed. Today the sacred space pulsed with life. His new nanny, Janet Foster, lay sleeping in the center of his king-sized bed, her rich brown skin glowing like burnished gold against the ivory silk sheets. Her natural hair spread across Eleonora's pillow like a crown of midnight silk, and her face, God, her face held a peace so profound it made his chest tighten with something he'd forgotten how to feel. But it wasn't Janet alone that made his breath catch in his throat. Curled against her like sleeping angels were his twin daughters, 6-year-old Kirsty and Betty, their small bodies pressed trustingly against the woman who had somehow, in just 3 weeks, become their sanctuary. Kirsty's thumb was tucked securely in her mouth, a habit that had returned after her mother's death, while Betty clutched her worn stuffed elephant, the one she'd refused to let anyone wash because it still smelled like Eleonora's lavender soap. Tom's hand gripped the doorframe as 17 different emotions crashed through him at once. Fury that someone had dared enter his wife's sacred space. Relief that his daughters looked more peaceful than they had in 2 years. Terror at the way his heart hammered against his ribs as he watched Janet's chest rise and fall in sleep. And underneath it all, a dangerous warmth that whispered of possibilities he'd sworn never to consider again. 3 days of brutal negotiations in Chicago had left him exhausted, but seeing this, his children finding comfort in another woman's arms, sent adrenaline coursing through his veins like electricity. Tom should fire her. He should demand explanations. He should restore the boundaries that kept his world safe, predictable, and under his complete control, the same iron control that had made him one of the most feared estate owners in Virginia. Instead, he found himself stepping into the room, moving with the silent authority that had crushed countless business rivals, studying the woman who had somehow managed to do what 17 previous nannies could not, make his daughters feel safe. Janet Foster was nothing like the 17 nannies who had come before her. She didn't possess the crisp efficiency of Mrs. Hartwell, who had quit after Kirsty superglued her shoes to the floor. She lacked the stern authority of Miss Thompson, who'd fled after Betty called emergency services, claiming abandonment by caregiver. She bore no resemblance to the parade of young, eager girls who'd seen dollar signs in caring for a wealthy widower's children, all of whom had wilted under Tom's demanding standards and cold dismissals. No, Janet was something else entirely. Something that made his daughters laugh again. Something that filled his empty house with music and warmth. Something that threatened every wall he'd built around his heart. And Tom Conway did not appreciate threats to his control. As if sensing his presence, Kirsty stirred in her sleep, her small voice drifting through the golden afternoon light. "Mama Janet keeps the monsters away," she whispered, unconsciously reaching for Janet's hand. "She sings the nightmares gone." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. His daughters hadn't felt safe since losing their mother. They'd tested every caregiver, driven away every woman who'd tried to comfort them, as if ensuring that no one could ever hurt them by leaving again. But here was Janet Foster, somehow breaking through their defenses, somehow making them believe in safety again. And that thought should have filled him with gratitude. Instead, it filled him with panic. Janet's eyes fluttered open then, those deep brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. For a moment she looked confused, disoriented by sleep and the unfamiliar surroundings. Then she saw him standing there, and her expression shifted to something that made his breath catch. Not fear or guilt or apology, but quiet dignity mixed with fierce, protective love. She didn't bolt upright with excuses. She didn't wake the children with startled movements. Instead, she carefully, gently extracted herself from their sleeping embrace, moving with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent years caring for traumatized children. Every motion was deliberate, protective, designed to preserve their peace even as she faced his scrutiny. "Mr. Conway," she whispered, her voice carrying the soft cadence of her South Carolina childhood. "They had nightmares again, both of them. They were afraid you wouldn't come home." The explanation was simple, logical. But watching her smooth Kirsty's hair with infinite tenderness, seeing how Betty instinctively curled toward Janet's warmth even in sleep, Tom realized that logic had nothing to do with what was happening here. "You brought them to my bedroom," he said quietly, his voice carrying no accusation, just a statement of fact that somehow demanded an explanation for the impossible. Janet's chin lifted slightly, that gesture of quiet dignity that had impressed his estate manager Ephraim Whitmore, enough to hire her against Tom's initial reservations. "They asked for somewhere safe," she replied, her eyes never leaving his. "Somewhere that still smelled like their mama. Somewhere they could feel close to the love that's still here." The honesty in her voice was devastating. She could have made excuses, could have apologized, could have gathered the children and fled. Instead, she stood there in his wife's bedroom, holding his gaze with steady brown eyes that seemed to understand exactly what this room meant to him. "I know what this place is to you," she continued softly, glancing around at Eleonora's untouched belongings. "I would never presume to disturb it lightly. But your daughters were drowning in their fear, and sometimes—" She paused, looking at the sleeping twins with such love that Tom's chest constricted. "Sometimes healing requires sacred spaces." He should have been angry. He should have felt violated, betrayed, furious that this stranger had dared to enter the shrine to his dead wife. Instead, watching Janet gather his sleeping daughters with infinite care, he felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 2 long years. "How long have they been having nightmares?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Since I arrived," Janet admitted, lifting Betty with practiced ease. "Every night. They dream that you leave for work and never come back. They dream that I disappear like their mother did. They dream that everyone they love turns to dust." The brutal honesty of it staggered him. He thought his daughters were healing, adjusting, learning to cope. He'd thrown himself into his work, telling himself that providing for them was the same as caring for them. But this woman, in 3 short weeks, had seen what he'd been too afraid to acknowledge. "I can take them back to their room," Janet offered, adjusting her hold on Betty. "I can sleep in the chair between their beds again, if that would be more appropriate." Again? The word escaped before he could stop it. A faint smile touched her lips, the first he'd seen since entering the room. "I haven't slept in my own bed since I started working here, Mr. Conway. Your daughters need to know that someone is there, that someone won't leave them alone in the dark." The revelation hit him like a sledgehammer. While he'd been congratulating himself on finding a nanny who could handle his difficult children, Janet had been sacrificing her own rest, her own comfort, sleeping in chairs and on floors to keep his daughters from drowning in their grief. As she moved toward the door, Kirsty still cradled in her arms, Tom found himself speaking without conscious thought. "Janet?" She turned, and in the golden afternoon light, she looked like something from a painting. A woman holding sleeping children, surrounded by love and light, and the kind of peace his house hadn't known in 2 years. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying all the weight of a father's gratitude and a man's growing recognition that his carefully ordered world was about to change forever. Janet smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face and made something flutter dangerously in his chest. "They're extraordinary children, Mr. Conway. They just need to remember how to trust that love doesn't always end in loss." As she carried his daughters from the room, Tom stood alone in his wife's bedroom, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the terrifying possibility of a future he'd never dared to imagine. The afternoon sun was setting now, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and for the first time in 2 years, the silence didn't feel like death. It felt like waiting, like holding its breath, like the moment before everything changed forever. Tom Conway had built his fortune on making smart decisions, calculated risks, investments that would pay off in the long run. But as he looked at the rumpled sheets where Janet Foster had held his daughters while they slept, he realized that the most important decision of his life had nothing to do with business at all. It had to do with whether he was brave enough to let healing begin. Chapter 2. Walls and Whispers. 10 days later, Tom Conway discovered that watching someone heal your children was more dangerous to his carefully constructed defenses than any business negotiation he'd ever faced. From his study window, he observed Janet in the garden with Kirsty and Betty, their laughter floating on the morning breeze, like music his estate hadn't heard in 2 years. She was teaching them to braid flower crowns, her patient hands guiding their small fingers as they worked with daisies and baby's breath. The sight should have brought him simple satisfaction, his daughters playing instead of grieving, smiling instead of testing boundaries with destructive behavior. Instead, it filled him with an unfamiliar vulnerability that made his coffee cup tremble in his hands, and Tom Conway despised feeling vulnerable. Because somewhere between Janet's first week and this morning, Tom had begun to anticipate the sound of her voice calling the twins for breakfast. He'd started finding excuses to pass through whatever room she occupied, just to catch glimpses of the way she transformed his cold mansion into something warm and alive. He'd begun to notice things, the graceful way she moved through his halls, the musical quality of her laugh when Betty told one of her elaborate stories, the fierce protectiveness that flashed in her dark eyes whenever his daughters needed defending. He was noticing Janet Foster as a woman, not just as his children's caregiver, and that recognition terrified him more than losing his fortune ever could. "You're brooding again," came the familiar voice of his estate manager and closest friend, Ephraim Whitmore, as he entered the study carrying a stack of correspondence. Tom didn't turn from the window, where Janet was now showing the twins how to weave dandelions into their flower chains. "I'm working," he replied, though his desk remained conspicuously clear of the financial reports he should have been reviewing. "Ah, yes," Ephraim said dryly, settling into the leather chair across from Tom's desk. "Working on watching your children's nanny teach them to make flower crowns. Very pressing business indeed." Tom finally turned, leveling his friend with a look that would have made lesser men reconsider their career choices. Ephraim, who had known him since college and had helped him build his empire from nothing, merely raised an amused eyebrow. "She's good with them," Tom said carefully, settling behind his desk and pretending to examine the quarterly reports Ephraim had brought. "She's exceptional with them," Ephraim corrected. "Yesterday, Betty asked me if children could have two mamas, one in heaven and one who makes pancakes. And Kirsty told Dr. Sophrona Beauchamp during her checkup that her nightmares stopped because Janet's hugs are magic." The words hit Tom squarely in the chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "She's doing her job well." "Tom," Ephraim's voice grew serious, "I've known you for 15 years. I was your best man when you married Eleonora, and I held you up at her funeral when you couldn't stand on your own. So believe me when I say this, what's happening here isn't just about the children." Before Tom could respond, a knock on the study door interrupted them. "Come in," he called, grateful for the reprieve. But it wasn't Janet who entered. It was his business rival, Casimir Alderidge, followed by a man Tom didn't recognize. Both were dressed in expensive suits and carried the predatory air of sharks circling wounded prey. "Conway," Casimir said, his voice carrying false warmth. "I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit. I was in the area with my associate, Mr. Thorne here, and thought we might discuss some business matters." Tom rose slowly, every instinct screaming danger. Casimir never did anything without calculation, and surprise visits meant he was planning something unpleasant. "Gentlemen," he said with the icy courtesy that had cowed lesser men, "to what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" "Mr. Thorne represents some investors who are very interested in your estate holdings," Casimir continued, his pale eyes scanning the study as if cataloging its contents. "They're particularly interested in your recent lifestyle changes." The words carried a threat that made Tom's blood run cold, but before he could respond, another knock sounded on the door. This time it was Janet who entered, carrying a silver tray with coffee and pastries. "Excuse me, Mr. Conway," she said, her voice carrying its usual warmth. "I thought your guests might enjoy some refreshments." Tom watched Casimir's expression change as he took in Janet's presence, the way his eyes traveled over her with obvious calculation, the slight smirk that suggested unpleasant thoughts. When Janet moved to serve the coffee, Casimir's attention lingered on her in a way that made Tom's hands clench into fists. "How lovely," Casimir said, his tone carrying undercurrents that made Tom's jaw tighten. "And who might this charming woman be?" "Miss Foster is my children's caregiver," Tom replied, his voice carefully neutral even as every protective instinct he possessed roared to life. "Caregiver," Casimir repeated, investing the word with implications that made Janet pause in her coffee service. "How progressive of you, Conway. Some might wonder about the wisdom of such intimate domestic arrangements for a man in your position." The insult was subtle but unmistakable, and Tom saw Janet's shoulders stiffen slightly. She finished serving the coffee with quiet dignity, but he caught the flash of hurt that crossed her features before she composed herself. "That will be all, Janet," Tom said gently. "Thank you." She nodded and moved toward the door, but not before Tom saw the way Casimir's companion watched her leave, his expression calculating in a way that made Tom want to throw them both out immediately. "Lovely woman," Thorne commented once Janet had gone. "Very devoted to her work, I'm sure." "Let's discuss why you're really here," Tom said, his patience evaporating like morning mist. Casimir smiled, but it was a predator's expression. "Very well. Mr. Thorne's investors are concerned about your company's recent instability. Your distraction from business matters, your questionable judgment in domestic affairs, your apparent inability to maintain the professional distance necessary for a man in your position. The implication was clear. They were using Janet's presence, her race, her role in his household, as ammunition against him. Tom felt rage building in his chest like a living thing, but he forced himself to remain calm. "My personal life is not up for discussion," he said quietly, but his tone carried enough steel to make lesser men step back. "Everything is up for discussion when it affects business," Casimir replied. "My investors are prepared to make a very generous offer for your company, Conway, one that would allow you to simplify your life considerably." The threat was barely veiled now. Buy them out, or they'd use his relationship with Janet, whatever they perceived it to be, to destroy his reputation and his business. "Gentlemen," Tom said, standing slowly, "this meeting is over." Casimir's smile widened. "Think about it, Conway. Some arrangements are more complicated than they're worth. Some risks carry consequences you might not have considered." After they left, Tom stood alone in his study, fury and fear warring in his chest. Through the window, he could see Janet still in the garden with his daughters, all three of them now wearing flower crowns and laughing at something Betty had said. They looked like a family. They looked like happiness. They looked like everything he'd thought he'd lost forever. And now Casimir was threatening to use that against him. "Sir?" Ephraim's quiet voice drew him from his dark thoughts. "Should I be concerned?" "They're planning a hostile takeover," Tom said, his voice rough with emotion. "And they're going to use Janet to justify it." "Then you need to decide what matters more," Ephraim replied. "Your company or your family." Tom looked out at the garden again, where Janet was now chasing the twins in some elaborate game of tag, her joyful laughter mixing with theirs in a symphony of pure happiness. Family. The word lodged in his throat like a stone. When had he started thinking of Janet as family? That evening, after the twins were asleep, Tom found Janet in the library organizing their school books. She looked up when he entered, and he saw the careful distance in her expression, the professional mask she'd worn around him ever since Casimir's visit. "Janet," he began, then stopped, unsure what he wanted to say. "The children are settled for the night," she said formally. "Is there anything else you need, Mr. Conway?" The return to formality stung more than he expected. "About earlier." "It's fine," she interrupted, but he caught the brief flash of pain in her eyes. "I understand my position here." "Do you?" he asked, moving closer. "Because I'm not sure I understand mine anymore." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw his own confusion reflected in her dark eyes. For a moment, the careful distance between them wavered, and he glimpsed something that made his heart race with dangerous possibilities. "Mr. Conway," she said softly, "some lines shouldn't be crossed." "What if they already have been?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. Outside, night was falling over the estate, painting the library in shades of amber and shadow. In the golden lamplight, Janet looked ethereal, beautiful, like something from a dream he'd forgotten how to have. "Your daughters need stability," she said finally. "They need to know that the people they depend on won't disappear." "And what do you need, Janet?" The question seemed to catch her off guard, and for a moment her careful composure cracked. "I need to do my job," she whispered. "I need to keep them safe and happy and whole." "And what about keeping yourself safe?" She looked away then, but not before he saw the longing in her eyes, the same dangerous longing that was building in his own chest like a storm. "Good night, Mr. Conway," she said, gathering the books with hands that trembled slightly. As she moved past him toward the door, Tom caught her hand gently, stopping her. The contact was electric, sending warmth racing up his arm and making his breath catch in his throat. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For today. For every day. For giving them back their smiles." Janet looked down at their joined hands, and when she looked back up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "They're extraordinary children," she whispered. "They deserve all the love in the world." "So do you," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. For a heartbeat, they stood there in the golden lamplight, hands touching, hearts racing, balanced on the edge of something that could change everything. Then Janet gently pulled away, leaving him standing alone in the library with the echo of possibilities he didn't dare name. That night, Tom lay awake in his study, listening to the sounds of his house settling around him. Somewhere in the servants' quarters, Janet was probably lying awake too, thinking about the moment when everything almost changed. Tomorrow he would have to decide what mattered more, the empire he'd built or the family he was just beginning to discover. Tonight he let himself imagine what it might feel like to choose love over fear. For the first time in 2 years, the possibility didn't terrify him. It thrilled him. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Armor. The thunderstorm that broke over the Virginia countryside 5 weeks after Janet's arrival shattered more than just the sultry summer heat. It cracked open the armor around Tom Conway's heart that he'd spent 2 years perfecting. He jolted awake in his study at 2 in the morning to the sound of screaming. Not the sharp cry of physical pain, but the soul-deep wail of children lost in the maze of their own terror. By the time he reached the hallway, Janet was already there, moving between Kirsty and Betty's rooms, like a guardian angel in a cotton nightgown, her voice soft and soothing as she tried to calm his daughter's fears. The sight stopped Tom cold. For 2 years he'd handled his daughter's nightmares with the same cold efficiency he applied to everything else. Quick comfort, immediate return to bed, problem solved. But watching Janet's infinite patience, seeing how she made their terror melt away with gentle songs and whispered stories, Tom realized his arrogant assumption that he could control their healing had been painfully wrong. "Daddy," Betty sobbed when she saw him, her small body shaking with tremors that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. "I dreamed you went to heaven like Mama. I dreamed you didn't come back." Tom gathered his youngest daughter into his arms, feeling her tears soak through his shirt as thunder crashed overhead. Across the hall he could hear Janet's melodic voice, singing something soft and lilting to Kirsty, whose nightmare screams had quieted to whimpering sobs. "I'm here, princess," he whispered against Betty's hair. "Daddy's not going anywhere." But even as he spoke the words, Tom realized the cruel irony of his promise. Since Eleanora's death, he'd been gone more than he'd been present, losing himself in board meetings and business deals, using work as a shield against the pain of existing in a house filled with memories. His daughters had learned to fear his absence because his absence had become their reality. For the next 4 hours, as the storm raged and his children fought their demons, Tom watched Janet move between their rooms with infinite patience. She never raised her voice, never showed frustration, never stopped offering comfort, even when exhaustion painted dark circles under her eyes. She sang lullabies in 3 different languages, told stories about brave princesses who conquered their fears, and created shadow puppets on the walls that turned monsters into friends. When dawn finally broke, gray and weary over the estate, Tom found Janet slumped against the wall between the twins' doorways, still keeping watch even in sleep. Her head had fallen back against the pale yellow wallpaper, her lips slightly parted, her hands still positioned as if ready to comfort a child who might cry out in the night. She looked exhausted. She looked beautiful. She looked like everything he'd forgotten he needed. "Janet," he whispered, kneeling beside her. Her eyes fluttered open, immediately alert despite her obvious fatigue. "Are they?" "Sleeping," he assured her, gesturing toward both rooms where his daughters finally lay peaceful. "You can rest now." "I should check on them," she began, starting to rise. "You should sleep," Tom said gently, catching her arm. "You've been awake all night." "So have you," she pointed out, and he realized she was right. Somewhere during the long night vigil, they'd become partners in caring for his children, sharing the load in a way that felt as natural as breathing. "Come on," he said, helping her to her feet. "Let me make you some coffee." In the kitchen, as early morning light filtered through the windows and the coffee maker hummed to life, Tom found himself studying Janet's profile as she stood, gazing out at the rain-washed garden. Her natural hair was mussed from the night, her simple nightgown and robe somehow more elegant than any designer dress he'd ever seen. "How long have they been having nightmares this severe?" he asked, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "Since their mother died," Janet replied honestly, accepting the steaming cup with grateful hands. "But they've gotten worse lately. They're terrified of losing you, too." The words hit him like a physical blow. "I didn't know." "They didn't want you to know," she said gently. "Children often protect their surviving parent by hiding their pain. They were afraid that if you knew how scared they were, you might—" She trailed off, but he understood. "Send them away," he finished. "Let someone else raise them because I can't handle it." "They're 6 years old, Tom," Janet said, and the use of his first name sent warmth spreading through his chest. "Their entire world collapsed when they lost their mother. Now they live in constant fear that their father will disappear too." Tom sank into the chair across from her, the weight of his failures as a parent crushing down on him. "I thought I was protecting them by working more, by building financial security for their future. I thought—" "You thought that providing for them was the same as being present for them," Janet interrupted softly. "It's a common mistake among grieving parents." "Is that your professional opinion, Doctor Foster?" he asked, but there was no sarcasm in his voice, only genuine curiosity. "It's my personal experience," she replied, her dark eyes growing distant. "I lost my fiancé 3 years ago in a car accident. For months afterward, I threw myself into work, thinking that helping other people's children heal would somehow make the pain more bearable." Tom felt something shift in his chest, a recognition, a kinship with someone who understood the particular weight of loss. "Did it work?" "No," she said simply. "Grief isn't something you can outrun or hide from. It demands to be felt, to be processed, to be honored. Your daughters need you to grieve with them, not despite them." They sat in comfortable silence as the morning light grew stronger, 2 wounded souls finding unexpected solace in shared understanding. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming. "Janet," Tom began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the question burning in his chest. "Yes?" "Why did you take this job? You could work anywhere, help any family. Why here? Why us?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because when I met your daughters, I saw myself at their age, lost, afraid, convinced that everyone I loved would leave me. And when I met you—" She paused, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I saw a man drowning in his love for his children, desperate to do right by them, but terrified of failing them. And I thought maybe we could help each other heal." The honesty in her words was devastating, beautiful, terrifying. Tom reached across the small table and covered her hand with his, marveling at how perfectly their fingers seemed to fit together. "I haven't been a very good father since Eleonora died," he admitted. "You've been a grieving father," Janet corrected. "There's a difference." Before Tom could respond, his phone buzzed with an urgent message from his lawyer. Casimir Aldridge had filed preliminary papers for a hostile takeover, citing Tom's compromised judgment and divided attention as justification for investor concerns. "What is it?" Janet asked, seeing his expression darken. "Business," he said tersely, not wanting to involve her in the battle brewing around them. "Nothing for you to worry about." But even as he spoke the words, Tom realized they were a lie. Everything that happened to him affected Janet now, just as everything that happened to her affected him. Somewhere in the space between her arrival and this morning, their lives had become entwined in ways that went far beyond employer and employee. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "I should let you get some rest," he said, standing to clear their coffee cups. "Tom," Janet said, rising as well. When he turned to look at her, she was standing close enough that he could see the golden flecks in her brown eyes, close enough that the scent of her lavender soap made his head spin. "Thank you," she said simply, "for trusting me with them, for letting me be part of this." "Thank you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion, "for giving me back my daughters." They stood there in the golden morning light, separated by mere inches and 1,000 unspoken possibilities. Tom found himself studying the curve of her lips, the elegant line of her neck, the way her pulse fluttered in the hollow of her throat. He wanted to kiss her. The realization hit him like lightning, sending shockwaves through his entire body. He wanted to kiss her, to hold her, to tell her that she'd done more than heal his children. She'd begun to heal him too. But before he could act on the dangerous impulse, the sound of small feet on the stairs broke the spell between them. Kirsty appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes and looking smaller than her 6 years. "Janet?" she said uncertainly. "Are you still here?" "I'm still here, sweetheart," Janet assured her, immediately shifting into caregiver mode. "Did you sleep well after the storm?" "I dreamed about pancakes," Kirsty announced, and both adults laughed at the beautifully normal request. "Pancakes it is," Janet said, moving toward the refrigerator. "Would you like to help me make them?" As Tom watched his daughter climb onto a stool to help Janet measure flour, as he listened to their easy chatter and saw Kirsty's face light up with simple joy, he realized that the cracks in his armor weren't weaknesses. They were letting the light back in. For 2 years he'd lived in darkness, convinced that protecting his heart meant protecting his children. But watching Janet teach Kirsty to flip pancakes while humming softly under her breath, Tom understood that healing didn't require walls. It required courage. The courage to let someone in. The courage to risk loving again. The courage to believe that some people stayed. As Betty joined them in the kitchen, drawn by the smell of breakfast and the sound of laughter, Tom felt something shift permanently in his chest. They looked like a family, messy and imperfect and beautifully real. And for the first time since Eleanor's death, that didn't feel like a betrayal of her memory. It felt like coming home. Later that morning, after breakfast had been eaten and the twins had been dispatched to play in the garden, Tom found himself alone with Janet in the kitchen once more. She was washing dishes, humming the same lullaby she'd sung during the storm, and the domestic simplicity of the moment made his heart ache with unexpected longing. "Janet," he said, his voice catching slightly. She turned, soap bubbles still clinging to her hands, and looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "I need you to know," he began, then stopped, struggling to find words for feelings he'd thought were buried forever. "What you've done for us, for them, for me, it's more than just a job. You've given us back our lives." "You've given me a purpose," she replied softly. "A reason to believe that love doesn't always end in loss." They stood there in the sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows, surrounded by the ordinary magic of pancake batter and coffee cups, while something extraordinary passed between them. A recognition, an acknowledgement, a promise of possibilities neither dared to name. Outside, his daughters. Laughter echoed across the garden, free and joyful and alive. Inside, Tom Conway felt his carefully guarded heart crack open just a little wider, letting in more light, more hope, more love than he'd thought possible. The armor he'd built to protect himself was crumbling, and for the first time in 2 years, He was grateful for the cracks. Chapter 4. The Art of Falling. 3 weeks after the storm, Tom Conway made a discovery that would have sent his business rivals into shocked silence. The most ruthlessly controlled man in Virginia was standing in an art gallery, commissioning a portrait because he'd fallen completely, helplessly in love with the way sunlight looked in a woman's hair. "You want me to paint what, exactly?" asked Roxalana Ashbourne, Janet's best friend and the owner of the most prestigious gallery in Richmond. Her Turkish ancestry had blessed her with dramatic dark eyes that could intimidate wealthy collectors. But right now they held only amused confusion as she studied Tom across her mahogany desk. "Janet, reading to my daughters," Tom repeated, feeling his legendary composure crack around the edges. "In the library. There's this moment every evening when the light comes through the windows, just so, and she—" He trailed off, realizing how far he'd fallen from the man who'd once prided himself on never showing weakness. "And she looks like a Renaissance Madonna come to life," Roxalana finished with a knowing smile. "Tom Conway, you magnificent fool, you're completely gone for her, aren't you?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. In business, Tom was legendary for his poker face, but something about Roxalana's warm understanding stripped away his usual defenses. "Is it that obvious?" he asked, sinking into the leather chair across from her desk. "Only to someone who knows what love looks like," she replied gently. "Janet talks about you and those girls constantly. She lights up like a Christmas tree when she mentions how Betty finally learned to tie her shoes, or how Kirsty wrote a story about brave princesses. But when she talks about you—" Roxalana paused, studying his face. "When she talks about you, she gets this look, like she's discovered something precious and fragile that she's afraid to touch." "She thinks I'm her employer," Tom said, running a hand through his hair. "She thinks crossing that line would be unprofessional." "And what do you think?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Tom wasn't sure he was ready to face. What did he think? That Janet Foster had walked into his broken family and somehow made them whole again? That watching her braid his daughter's hair sent warmth shooting through his chest like sunlight? That the sound of her laughter had become the best part of his day? "I think," he said slowly, "that I'm falling in love with my children's nanny, and I have no idea what to do about it." Roxalana's smile was radiant. "You do what men have been doing since the beginning of time, darling. You fight for her." 2 days later, Tom stood in his garden at sunset, watching Janet chase fireflies with Kirsty and Betty. She'd kicked off her sensible shoes and hiked up her skirt to run barefoot through the grass, her laughter mixing with his daughter's squeals of delight as they tried to catch the dancing lights. In that moment, she looked nothing like the professional nanny who organized their schedules and supervised their homework. She looked young and carefree and radiant, like a woman who'd forgotten to be careful with her heart. "Daddy, come help us," Betty called, waving him over with dirt-stained hands. "Janet says fireflies are fairy lights, and if we catch enough, they'll grant us wishes." "Is that so?" Tom asked, moving to join them in the grass. "And what are you wishing for?" "For you to be happy," Kirsty said with the devastating honesty of childhood. "You smile more when Janet's here." The innocent words hit Tom like a physical blow, and when he looked up, he found Janet watching him with something soft and vulnerable in her dark eyes. "Children see everything," she said quietly as the twins raced off after another cluster of fireflies. "What do you see, Janet?" he asked, moving closer to her in the gathering twilight. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the golden light. "I see a man who's learning to live again," she said finally. "A father who's remembering how to play with his children. A person who's braver than he thinks he is." "And what about you?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you learning?" "I'm learning that healing isn't always quiet and solitary," she replied, her gaze dropping to his lips for just a moment before she caught herself. Sometimes it's loud and messy and full of 6-year-olds who think vegetables are poisonous. They both laughed, but the sound was breathless, charged with the electricity building between them, like the storm that had broken them open weeks ago. "Janet," Tom began, reaching for her hand. "We should go in," she said quickly, stepping back. "The girls need their baths, and you have that conference call with Tokyo." But even as she retreated into the safety of schedules and responsibilities, Tom saw the longing in her eyes, the same dangerous longing that was building in his chest like a tide. That night, after the twins were asleep and Janet had retreated to her cottage, Tom found himself walking the moonlit grounds of his estate, too restless to sleep. He ended up at the old garden pavilion where he and Eleonora used to sit on summer evenings, back when the future seemed infinite and love felt indestructible. He expected to feel guilty for thinking about another woman in this sacred space. Instead, he felt Eleonora's presence like a blessing, a gentle whisper of approval for the healing happening in his heart. "I loved you," he said aloud to the night air. "I'll always love you, but I think you'd want me to live again." The sound of footsteps on gravel made him turn, and there was Janet, wrapped in a cream-colored shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders like silk. "I couldn't sleep," she said simply. The cottage felt too quiet after all the excitement. "Join me?" he asked, gesturing to the stone bench where he sat. She hesitated for just a moment, then settled beside him, careful to maintain distance even as her presence filled all the empty spaces in his chest. "It's beautiful here," she said, gazing out at the moonlit garden. "Peaceful." "Eleonora designed this garden," Tom said quietly. "She said she wanted a place where magic could grow." "Magic is growing here," Janet replied, her voice soft with wonder. "Your daughters are proof of that. The way they've healed, the way they trust again. It's miraculous." "You're the miracle," Tom said, turning to look at her profile in the moonlight. "You brought them back to life." "We brought each other back to life," she corrected, finally meeting his gaze. "I was drowning in my own grief before I came here. Your family saved me as much as I helped save you." The honesty in her words was devastating, beautiful, terrifying. Tom found himself leaning closer, drawn by the warmth in her eyes and the way moonlight caught in her hair like captured starlight. "Janet," he whispered, his hand coming up to trace the curve of her cheek. She didn't pull away this time. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for just a moment before opening again to meet his gaze. "Tom," she breathed, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer. He was going to kiss her. Every cell in his body demanded it. Every instinct screamed that this was right, that she belonged in his arms, that love didn't have to end in loss. But just as his lips were about to touch hers, the sound of his phone buzzing shattered the moment like glass. An emergency alert from his security system. Someone was on the property. They sprang apart, the spell broken, reality crashing back in waves of responsibility and caution. By the time Tom's security team determined it was just a deer triggering the motion sensors, Janet had rebuilt her walls, stepped back into her role as employee rather than the woman who'd almost let him kiss her under the stars. "I should go," she said, avoiding his eyes. "It's late and tomorrow is busy." "Janet, wait." But she was already walking away, her shawl flowing behind her, like a ghost of what might have been. Tom stood alone in the pavilion, his heart racing and his lips tingling with the kiss that hadn't happened. Around him, Eleonora's garden bloomed in the moonlight, beautiful and serene and full of possibilities he was too afraid to claim. The next morning brought crisis in the form of Casimir Aldridge's latest attack. His lawyers had filed injunctions questioning Tom's fitness as a guardian, citing questionable domestic arrangements and compromised judgment. The subtext was clear. They were using his relationship with Janet, whatever they perceived it to be, as ammunition. They can't actually take the children, his lawyer assured him during an emergency meeting, but they can make things very uncomfortable, very public. And if there's any truth to their implications about your relationship with Ms. Foster ... There's nothing inappropriate happening, Tom said sharply, even as the memory of almost kissing her burned in his chest. Good, his lawyer replied, because any hint of impropriety could give them exactly the leverage they need. That afternoon, Tom found Janet in the library with the twins, helping them with their art project. The sight that greeted him, Janet with paint in her hair, Kirsty and Betty giggling as they decorated a canvas with handprints, should have filled him with joy. Instead, it filled him with terror, because looking at them he realized that Casimir was right about one thing. His judgment was compromised, not because he couldn't make good business decisions, but because he would sacrifice every dollar of his fortune to protect the woman and children who had become his whole world. "Girls," he said, forcing lightness into his voice, "why don't you go wash up for dinner? Janet and I need to discuss your schedule for tomorrow." When they were alone, Janet looked up at him with concern. "Is everything all right? You look terrified," he finished honestly. "I look terrified? Of what?" Tom studied her face, the face that had become as essential to his happiness as breathing, and felt his carefully constructed resolve crumble. "Of losing you," he said simply. "Of falling in love with you and having it destroy everything we've built." The words hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Janet's eyes filled with tears, but whether they were tears of joy or sorrow, Tom couldn't tell. "Tom," she whispered, his name broken and beautiful on her lips. "I know it's complicated," he rushed on. "I know there are 1,000 reasons why this is impossible, why we should maintain professional distance, why loving you could cost us everything." "And?" she asked, stepping closer. "And I don't care about any of them," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm falling in love with you, Janet Foster, and I don't know how to stop." She reached up and touched his face with paint-stained fingers, her brown eyes bright with unshed tears. "What if I don't want you to stop?" she whispered. And in that moment, standing in his library surrounded by children's artwork and the ghosts of what used to be, Tom Conway realized that the most terrifying thing about falling in love wasn't the possibility of losing everything. It was the possibility of gaining everything he'd never dared to dream of, and finally learning to believe he deserved it. Chapter 5. The Point of No Return. At 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, 9 weeks after Janet's arrival, a Tuesday that would forever divide Tom Conway's life into before and after, his phone rang with the kind of call every parent dreads. Betty was in the hospital, and she was asking for Janet. "Appendicitis," Dr. Sophrona Beauchamp explained tersely as Tom burst through the emergency room doors, still wearing the suit from his late dinner with estate investors, his usually perfect composure shattered by the frantic drive through empty streets. "We caught it just in time, but she needs surgery immediately." "Where is she?" Tom demanded, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm that matched the beeping machines surrounding them. "Room 3. But Tom," Dr. Beauchamp caught his arm as he started toward the corridor. "She's been crying for Janet since the ambulance brought her in. The school called you first, of course, but they said she won't let anyone else comfort her." The words hit Tom like a physical blow, a reminder of how completely Janet had woven herself into the fabric of his daughters' lives. Betty was scared and in pain, and the person she needed most wasn't her father. It was the woman who had become their sanctuary, their safe harbor in every storm. "I called Janet," Dr. Beauchamp continued gently. "She's on her way." Tom found his youngest daughter in the pre-op room, looking impossibly small against the white hospital sheets, her face streaked with tears and her little hand clutching the worn elephant that still smelled of Eleonora's lavender soap. When she saw him, her face crumpled with fresh sobs. "Daddy!" she wailed, reaching for him with desperate arms. "It hurts, and I was so scared you wouldn't come." "I'm here, Princess," Tom whispered, gathering her against his chest, feeling her tiny body shake with pain and fear. "Daddy's here, and you're going to be just fine." But even as he spoke the words, even as he held her close and stroked her hair and promised her everything would be all right, Tom could feel Betty's tension, her continued distress despite his presence. "Where's Janet?" she asked between hiccuping sobs. "I want Janet. She makes the scary things go away." Before Tom could answer, Janet appeared in the doorway, still wearing her nightgown under a hastily thrown-on coat, her hair flowing loose around her shoulders and her face pale with worry. She'd clearly run from her car, and her eyes immediately found Betty's small form on the hospital bed. "Oh, sweetheart," Janet breathed, rushing to Betty's side. "I'm here. Janet's here." The change in his daughter was immediate and profound. Betty's sobs quieted to whimpers, her body relaxing as Janet took her other hand and began speaking in the soft, melodic voice that had soothed countless nightmares. "The doctors are going to make your tummy all better," Janet said, smoothing Betty's hair with infinite tenderness. "And Daddy and I will be right here waiting for you when you wake up." "Promise?" Betty whispered, her 6-year-old eyes huge with fear. "I promise," Janet said solemnly, and Tom watched his daughter's grip on Janet's hand tighten with desperate trust. As the medical team prepared to take Betty to surgery, Tom found himself relegated to the background, watching Janet work her gentle magic while his own helplessness crashed over him in waves. He was Betty's father, her protector, the person who was supposed to make everything better. But in this crisis, it was Janet she needed, Janet she trusted to keep her safe. "Mr. Conway," a young nurse touched his elbow gently. "We need to take her now, but you can walk with us to the OR doors." The next few minutes passed in a blur of corridors and medical terminology, and Betty's small voice calling out, "Don't leave me, Janet. Don't leave me," until the heavy doors swung shut between them and silence fell like a curtain. Tom stood in the empty hallway staring at those closed doors, feeling more powerless than he had since the day Eleonora died. Beside him, Janet swayed slightly, and he realized she was shaking, not with cold, but with the aftermath of adrenaline and terror. "She's going to be fine," he said, as much to convince himself as to comfort her. "Dr. Beauchamp said they caught it early. Appendectomies are routine." "I know," Janet whispered, but her voice broke on the words. "I know she'll be fine. It's just, when they called, when they said she was hurt and scared." She didn't finish the sentence, but Tom understood. The fear of losing someone you love never really goes away. It just hibernates until crisis wakes it with claws and teeth. "Come on," he said gently, taking her arm. "Let's go to the waiting room. This could take a while." The surgical waiting area was painted in soft blues and greens, designed to be soothing. But Tom found no peace in the carefully chosen colors or comfortable chairs. He paced like a caged animal while Janet sat curled in a corner chair, her arms wrapped around herself, as if holding herself together by force of will. "Tom," she said quietly after an hour of silence, "sit down. You're going to wear a hole in the floor." He settled in the chair beside her, close enough to catch the faint scent of her lavender soap beneath the antiseptic hospital smell. They sat in silence for another hour, united in their fear and love for the little girl behind those surgical doors. "I've been thinking about what you said," Janet said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "About falling in love." Tom's heart stopped. "Janet—" "Let me finish," she interrupted, her dark eyes meeting his with devastating honesty. "I've been thinking about what you said and about what I've been feeling, and about how terrified I am of all of it." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," she said firmly. Because sitting here tonight, waiting to find out if Betty's going to be okay, I realized something important. Tom held his breath, afraid to hope, afraid to breathe, afraid to do anything that might shatter this moment of truth between them. I realized that I'm already in love with her, Janet continued, tears starting to slide down her cheeks. I'm already in love with both of them, and with you, and the thought of losing any of you is killing me. The words hit Tom like lightning, sending shockwaves through his entire body. She loved them. She loved him. This remarkable woman had opened her heart to his broken family and chosen to love them despite every risk, every complication, every reason to protect herself. Janet, he breathed, reaching for her hands. I know it's complicated, she rushed on, as if afraid she'd lose her courage. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this could be a disaster. I know your business rivals are using our relationship against you, and I know society will have opinions about us, and I know I love you too, Tom interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. I know I've been falling in love with you since the day I found you sleeping with my daughters in Eleanor's bed. I know you've healed us in ways I didn't think were possible, and I know that sitting here tonight, the only thing that matters is that we're in this together. Janet's tears came faster now, but they were tears of relief, of joy, of love finally acknowledged and shared. What happens now? She whispered. Before Tom could answer, Dr. Beauchamp appeared in the waiting room doorway, still wearing her surgical scrubs and smiling the tired but triumphant smile of a doctor bearing good news. She's perfect, she announced. Surgery went beautifully, no complications, and she's already asking for pancakes. The relief that flooded through Tom was so intense it left him dizzy. Betty was safe. His baby girl was going to be fine. She's asking for both of you, Dr. Beauchamp continued with a knowing smile. Specifically, she wants Daddy and Janet to come together because families stay together. Families. The word lodged in Tom's throat like a gift. As they walked toward Betty's recovery room, Tom caught Janet's hand in his, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of puzzle pieces finding their perfect fit. So what happens now? Janet asked again, echoing her earlier question. Now, Tom said, bringing her hand to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles, we stop being afraid of calling this what it is. And what is it? Tom stopped walking, turning to face her in the sterile hospital corridor, with fluorescent lights humming overhead and the distant sound of medical equipment beeping like mechanical heartbeats. It's love, he said simply. Complicated, terrifying, beautiful love. It's family. It's everything I thought I'd lost forever, and everything I never dared to hope for again. Janet smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her all night, and it was radiant enough to light up the entire hospital. I love you, Tom Conway, she said, standing on her tiptoes to press a soft kiss to his cheek. I love you and your beautiful daughters, and I'm done being afraid of that. I love you too, Janet Foster, he replied, his arms coming around her waist, and I'm done letting fear make decisions for us. As they entered Betty's room together, hand in hand, Tom felt something shift permanently in his chest. They'd crossed the point of no return, acknowledged what had been building between them for months, claimed their right to love each other despite every obstacle. Betty looked up at them from her hospital bed, her face still pale but her eyes bright with medication and relief. When she saw their joined hands, her face broke into a smile that was pure sunshine. Are you going to get married now? She asked with the devastating directness of childhood. Because Kirsty and I voted, and we want Janet to be our new mama. Tom looked at Janet, seeing his own shock and joy reflected in her dark eyes. They just admitted they loved each other, and already his daughters were planning their wedding. Well, Janet said, settling into the chair beside Betty's bed without releasing Tom's hand, I think that's something we'll need to discuss as a family. A family, Betty repeated happily, settling back against her pillows. I like that. As Tom watched Janet fuss over his daughter, adjusting her blankets and smoothing her hair with the automatic tenderness of a mother, he realized that love hadn't made things more complicated. It had made everything beautifully simple. They were a family. They'd been a family since the day Janet chose to comfort his children in their hour of need. Tonight, they'd simply found the courage to acknowledge what their hearts had known all along. Outside Betty's hospital room window, dawn was breaking over Virginia, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. It was the dawn of a new day, a new beginning, a new chapter in the love story that had started with a sleeping sanctuary and was growing into something powerful enough to heal them all. Tom Conway had spent 2 years believing that love ended in loss. Tonight, he'd learned that love could also end in finding everything you never knew you needed. And as he sat beside the woman he loved, watching her care for his daughter with infinite tenderness, Tom finally understood that the point of no return wasn't something to fear. It was something to celebrate. Chapter 6. Courage in the Darkness. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning exactly 1 week after Betty's surgery, delivered by Larkin Montague with hands that trembled slightly as he placed the cream-colored envelope on Tom's desk. An envelope that bore Eleanora's distinctive handwriting and carried the power to change everything. She made me promise, Larkin said quietly, his usually composed demeanor cracked with emotion as he watched Tom stare at his late wife's familiar script. 2 days before the cancer took her, when the doctors told her there was nothing more they could do, she wrote this: "Made me swear to give it to you when you found love again." Tom's hand shook as he picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of words written by the woman he'd loved with everything he had, intended for the moment when he'd found the courage to love again. Through his study window, he could see Janet in the garden with Kirsty and Betty, the 3 of them weaving flower crowns in the morning sunshine, their laughter floating on the warm Virginia breeze. She knew, Tom whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Somehow, she knew this would happen. Eleanora always said love recognizes love, Larkin replied gently. She told me that if she had to leave you, she wanted to make sure you didn't spend the rest of your life alone. She said ... He paused, swallowing hard. She said you deserved to remember how to smile. With fingers that felt clumsy and numb, Tom opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. Eleanora's voice speaking to him across the void of death, with words that made his eyes burn with tears. My darling Tom, if you're reading this, it means you've found someone who makes you remember how to smile. Don't you dare let my death steal your chance at happiness. I've watched you these past months, seen how you're drowning in grief and guilt, and it breaks my heart to know that loving me might keep you from loving again. The woman who captures your heart will be extraordinary. I know this because you are extraordinary, and you deserve nothing less. Love her with everything you have. Let our girls know what a family filled with joy looks like. Build something beautiful from the ashes of what we lost. I'm not asking you to forget me. I'm asking you to honor what we had by being brave enough to love again. The greatest tribute to our marriage would be for you to find happiness, to give Kirsty and Betty the gift of watching their father choose life over merely surviving. Be happy, my love. Be gloriously, completely, unapologetically happy. You have my blessing, my gratitude, and my eternal love. Always yours, Eleanora. P.S. I hid something in the old oak tree by the pavilion. When you're ready to take the next step, you'll know where to look. Tom read the letter 3 times, each word a gift of freedom he'd never expected to receive. Eleanora wasn't just giving him permission to love Janet. She was encouraging it, blessing it, celebrating the healing that had brought laughter back to their family. Tom? Larkin's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? She knew, Tom said again, looking up at his oldest friend through eyes bright with tears. She knew I'd fall in love with someone like Janet. Someone exactly like Janet, Larkin corrected gently. Eleonora was many things, but psychic wasn't one of them. She just knew you well enough to trust that when you were ready to love again, you'd choose someone worthy of that love. That afternoon, while the twins napped and Janet worked in the library organizing their school supplies, Tom slipped away to the old oak tree by the garden pavilion. Hidden in a hollow between the massive roots, wrapped in oiled cloth and protected from the elements, he found a small velvet box that made his breath catch in his throat. Inside was Eleonora's grandmother's ring, not her wedding band, which Tom had buried with her, but the antique sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had been passed down through 5 generations of strong women. Tucked beneath the ring was a note in Eleonora's handwriting, "For the woman who will love our family next." The generosity of it staggered him. Even facing death, Eleonora had been thinking of his future happiness, planning for the love he might find after losing her. She'd chosen the perfect ring for a woman she'd never meet, but somehow knew would be worthy of it. That evening, after dinner had been cleared and the twins were safely tucked into bed with stories and lullabies, Tom found Janet in the library where their love story had truly begun. She was curled in the reading chair by the window, a book forgotten in her lap as she gazed out at the moonlit garden. "You look thoughtful," he said, settling on the ottoman in front of her chair. "I've been thinking about us," she admitted, her dark eyes meeting his with the honesty that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "About what happens next, now that we've admitted how we feel. And what conclusions have you reached?" Janet was quiet for a moment, studying his face in the lamplight. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you and Kirsty and Betty with everything I have. But Tom, I'm terrified that loving you will destroy everything we've built." "What do you mean?" "Your business rivals are already using our relationship against you," she said, leaning forward to take his hands. "Society will have opinions about us, about our different backgrounds, about whether I'm good enough for you and your daughters. And your late wife's family has already given us their blessing," Tom interrupted gently. Janet blinked in surprise. "What?" Tom reached into his jacket and withdrew Eleonora's letter, watching Janet's eyes widen as she recognized the elegant handwriting. "Larkin brought this to me today. Eleonora wrote it before she died, with instructions to give it to me when I found love again." With shaking hands, Janet took the letter and read it, tears starting to slide down her cheeks as Eleonora's words of blessing and encouragement filled the space between them. "She wanted you to be happy," Janet whispered when she finished reading. "She wanted you to love again." "She wanted us to love again," Tom corrected. "All of us. She knew that grief had frozen our family in place, and she hoped that someday someone would help us remember how to live." "Tom," Janet began, but he silenced her gently with a finger against her lips. "I have something else," he said, pulling out the velvet box. Janet's breath caught as he opened it, revealing the sapphire ring that seemed to capture all the lamplight in the room and hold it like trapped starlight. "This was Eleonora's grandmother's ring," Tom explained, his voice rough with emotion. "She left it for the woman who would love our family next. Janet Foster, I'm not asking you to replace Eleonora. No one could ever do that. I'm asking you to build something new with us, something that honors what we've lost while celebrating what we've found." "Tom," Janet breathed, her eyes wide with wonder and fear and love. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said, his heart hammering against his ribs as he took the ring from the box. "I'm asking you to be my wife, Kirsty and Betty's mother, the woman who completes our family and makes us whole." Janet stared at the ring, then at his face, then back at the ring, as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. "I'm scared," she whispered honestly. "I'm scared of losing you, of not being enough, of society's judgment, of 1,000 things that could go wrong." "I'm scared too," Tom admitted. I'm terrified that loving you this much makes me vulnerable in ways I swore I'd never be again. But Janet, the alternative is worse. The alternative is spending the rest of my life safe and alone and miserable, watching my daughters grow up without ever seeing their father truly happy. And if something happens to me, she asked, her voice breaking, if I get sick or there's an accident or... Then we'll have loved each other completely while we could, Tom said firmly. Janet, I spent 2 years being afraid of loss instead of grateful for what I still had. I won't make that mistake again. I won't let fear steal one more day of happiness from us. Janet looked down at the ring again, then at Eleonora's letter, then at Tom's face, the face of the man who'd somehow convinced her that love didn't always end in sorrow. What do Kirsty and Betty think about this? She asked. Tom smiled. They've been planning our wedding since the hospital. Betty's already chosen her flower girl dress, and Kirsty's been practicing walking in high heels so she can be your maid of honor. Despite her tears, Janet laughed, the sound bright and joyful and full of hope. They really want me to be their mother. They already consider you their mother, Tom said gently. This would just make it official. Janet was quiet for a long moment, studying the ring that represented not just Tom's love, but Eleonora's blessing and the girl's acceptance and the promise of a family built on something stronger than fear. Yes, she whispered, extending her trembling hand. Yes, I'll marry you. The ring slipped onto her finger as if it had been made for her, the sapphire catching the lamplight and throwing blue fire against the library walls. Tom pulled her into his arms then, holding her close as months of careful distance finally dissolved into the relief of acknowledged love. I love you, he murmured against her hair. I love you, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt it. I love you too, she replied, pulling back to look at his face. All of you. This whole complicated, beautiful, impossible family. They kissed then, soft and sweet and full of promise, in the library where their love had taken root and grown into something neither had dared to hope for. Outside, the Virginia night was warm and peaceful, full of possibility and starlight, and the whispered blessings of a woman who'd loved them enough to set them free. When they finally broke apart, breathless and glowing with happiness, Janet looked down at the ring on her finger and smiled. What happens now? She asked. Now, Tom said, pulling her close again, we tell our daughters that Janet Foster is going to become Janet Conway, and we start planning the wedding of the century. Just promise me one thing, Janet said, her dark eyes serious despite her smile. Anything. Promise me we'll always remember how precious this is, she said, gesturing to encompass everything, the ring, the love, the family they'd built from broken pieces. Promise me we'll never take it for granted. I promise, Tom said solemnly, sealing the vow with another kiss that tasted like forever. In the distance, they could hear the sound of little feet on stairs, their daughters, drawn by some sixth sense, that something momentous had happened in the quiet library where their family's love story had begun. Daddy? Janet? Came Kirsty's sleepy voice from the doorway. Are you getting married now? Tom and Janet looked at each other and laughed, the sound bright with joy and wonder, and the perfect rightness of everything falling into place. Yes, sweetheart, Janet said, opening her arms to welcome both girls as they ran to her. We're getting married. Finally, Betty exclaimed, throwing her arms around Janet's neck. We've been waiting forever. As Tom watched his daughters celebrate with the woman who would soon officially be their mother, as he felt Janet's hand warm and sure in his, and saw the sapphire ring catching the light like a promise, he realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing love anyway, despite the fear, because of the magnificent possibilities that lay waiting on the other side of bravery. They'd found the courage to love again. Now they were going to find the courage to build a future together, one day at a time, one kiss at a time, one moment of joy at a time. And it was going to be beautiful. Chapter 7. Building Bridges. 2 weeks after Tom's proposal, Janet Conway-to-be discovered that planning a wedding was significantly easier than learning to be loved by a man who treated her like a queen, especially when his 6-year-old daughters had appointed themselves wedding consultants with very strong opinions. "The roses have to be white," Kirsty announced from her perch on the kitchen counter, where she was supposedly helping Janet prepare lunch while actually commandeering the entire wedding planning process. "Because white means new beginnings, and you and Daddy are getting a new beginning." "And there have to be fairy lights everywhere," Betty added from the table, where she was drawing wedding dress designs. "Like the fireflies we caught that night when Daddy started smiling again." Janet smiled as she watched the twins plan her wedding with serious concentration. In the 2 weeks since Tom had proposed, their family dynamic had shifted beautifully. The girls no longer called her Janet with formality. Now she was Janet, who's going to be our mama, delivered with breathless excitement. "What do you think about the music?" Janet asked. "What songs should we dance to?" "Something that makes Daddy cry happy tears," Kirsty said immediately. "Like when he watches you sing us to sleep." "And something that makes you spin around like a princess," Betty added with a dramatic twirl. "Those are excellent suggestions," Janet said seriously. "I'll make sure to tell Daddy about the spinning requirement." "Tell Daddy what about spinning?" Tom's voice from the doorway made all three of them turn, and Janet felt her pulse quicken the way it had every time she'd seen him over the past 2 weeks. Her engagement had given her permission to openly admire everything about him. "That Janet has to spin when you dance at the wedding," Betty explained seriously. "It's a rule." "A very important rule," Tom agreed, moving to wrap his arms around Janet's waist. The casual intimacy still sent shivers down her spine. "Any other rules I should know about?" he asked, pressing a kiss to Janet's head that made both girls giggle. "No boring speeches," Kirsty declared, "and the cake has to have flowers that taste good." "Noted," Tom said solemnly. "Anything else?" "You have to promise to love Janet forever and ever," Betty said, her face suddenly serious. "Even when she gets old and wrinkly." "I promise," Tom said, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise to love Janet forever and ever, even when we're both old and telling you girls to turn down your music." Later that afternoon, Janet found herself at Atelier Ravensdale's exclusive bridal boutique, surrounded by silk and satin, while the twins sat on a velvet couch like tiny judges. "My dear," Ottilie said, stepping back to survey Janet in the ivory silk dress, "you are absolutely glowing. Tom Conway is a very fortunate man." Janet turned to the three-way mirror, barely recognizing the radiant woman staring back. The dress was simple but exquisite, ivory silk that flowed like water, with delicate beading that caught the light. "What do you think, girls?" Janet asked. "You look like a real princess," Betty breathed. "You look like someone Daddy would want to marry," Kirsty added with 6-year-old pragmatism. "You're not supposed to see the dress before the wedding," Ottilie scolded, as Tom appeared in the doorway. "I'm not looking at the dress," Tom replied, his eyes fixed on Janet's face. "I'm looking at my fiancée, and she's perfect." "How did your meeting go?" Janet asked, worried about the ongoing business pressures. "Better than expected," Tom said. "Larkin's legal team found discrepancies in Casimir's financial filings. Turns out he's been embezzling from his own charity foundation." "How fortunate for us," Tom continued. "It means his accusations lose credibility when they come from someone under federal investigation." "Does this mean the threats are over?" Janet asked. "This means we can focus on our wedding," Tom said, moving beside her. In the mirror, they looked like a picture from a magazine. "Speaking of which," Ottilia interjected, "I have something for you." She returned carrying a delicate veil that seemed made of starlight. "This belonged to Eleonora," she said gently. She wore it on her wedding day and asked me to keep it for whoever might need it next. Janet stared at the veil, touched by Eleanora's continued generosity. I don't know if I should, she began. You should, Tom said firmly. Eleanora would want you to have it. With trembling hands, Janet allowed Ottilie to place the veil on her head, watching in the mirror as it transformed her into a bride ready to marry the man she loved. Perfect, Kirsty announced. Now you look like you belong with Daddy. She's always belonged with me, Tom said quietly. I just had to be brave enough to admit it. That evening, as they walked through the garden toward the pavilion, Janet reflected on how much had changed. 3 weeks, Janet said, her hand secure in Tom's. 3 weeks until we're married. Having second thoughts? Tom asked teasingly. Only about the menu, Janet replied. Kirsty's ice cream demands might be problematic. They settled on the stone bench, watching fireflies dance among the roses. Tom, she said quietly, do you ever worry we're moving too fast? Janet, when you've lost someone you love, you learn not to waste time pretending you don't know what you want, Tom replied. And what I want is you. I want to wake up next to you every morning, watch you teach our daughters about strength and grace, build something beautiful together. Our daughters, Janet repeated, testing the precious words. From the moment you fell asleep with them in my bedroom, they've been our daughters, Tom said. The wedding just makes it official. Janet looked at her sapphire engagement ring, then back at Tom. I love you, she said with wonder and gratitude. I love you too, Tom replied, pulling her closer. And in 3 weeks, I get to promise that to you in front of everyone who matters. As he kissed her under the star-filled Virginia sky, surrounded by the garden where their love had bloomed, Janet felt pure happiness. They were building bridges between his past and their future, between her dreams and his reality, between two hearts that had found wholeness in each other. They were already forever. They were already home. Chapter 8, Shadows and Light. The scandal broke on a Tuesday morning exactly 10 days before the wedding, shattering the peaceful Virginia dawn with headlines that made Tom Conway's blood run cold. Millionaire's mysterious finances, questions raised about Children's Trust Fund as wedding approaches. Tom stared at his phone screen in his study, reading the devastating article that painted him as either incompetent with money or deliberately deceptive about his daughter's inheritance. But it was the final paragraph that made his hands shake with rage. Sources close to the investigation suggest that Conway's new romantic relationship may have compromised his judgment regarding the girl's financial security, raising questions about whether the upcoming marriage is motivated by love or financial desperation. The implication was clear, calculated, and utterly destroying. Someone had planted evidence suggesting that Tom had mismanaged Kirsty and Betty's trust fund, and that he was marrying Janet to gain access to her modest savings to cover the shortfall. It was ridiculous, insulting, and unfortunately believable enough to cause serious damage. Tom? Janet's voice from the doorway made him look up, and he saw immediately that she'd read the article too. Her face was pale, her dark eyes wide with shock and hurt, and she was holding her phone with the careful precision of someone trying not to drop something fragile. It's not true, he said immediately, standing and moving toward her. Janet, none of it is true. The girls' trust fund is perfectly intact, and I would never. I know, she said quietly, but he heard the tremor in her voice. I know you would never do anything to hurt them financially. But Tom, this is going to destroy everything. Before he could respond, his phone rang with a call from his lawyer, then another from his accountant, then 3 more from board members demanding explanations for accusations that made no sense, but would require weeks to disprove. By noon, Tom's entire legal team was assembled in his study, drowning in paperwork and forensic accounting reports, while Janet tried to maintain normalcy for the twins, who sensed the tension crackling through their house like electricity before a storm. "It's sophisticated," Larkin Montague said grimly, spreading financial documents across Tom's desk. "Someone with serious resources and accounting knowledge planted evidence in 3 different systems, making it look like funds were moved out of the girls' accounts over the past month." "Casimir," Tom said flatly. "Almost certainly, but proving it will take time," Larkin replied. "The problem is, Tom, this kind of accusation, even false ones, can have serious consequences. Child Protective Services is required to investigate any claims of financial abuse involving minors." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. "They could take the girls." "Temporarily, until this is resolved," Larkin said gently. "I'm doing everything I can to prevent that, but if they find any irregularities, even ones that are eventually explained—" "How long?" Tom asked, his voice rough. "Weeks, maybe months." Tom sank into his chair, the weight of potential loss crushing down on him like a landslide. Just when he'd found happiness again, just when his family had healed and his future looked bright, someone was threatening to tear it all away. "There's something else," Larkin said reluctantly. "The story is suggesting that Ms. Foster might be complicit in the alleged embezzlement. As your fiancée, she could be seen as having financial motivation to—" "Stop," Tom said sharply. "Don't even finish that sentence." But the damage was already done. Through the study window, Tom could see photographers gathering at his estate gates, drawn by the scent of scandal involving a wealthy widower, his mysterious nanny-turned-fiancé, and questions about missing money. That afternoon, Janet found herself trapped in her own home, watching from the windows as reporters camped outside, while her phone buzzed with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. The headlines were getting worse. "Gold Digger or True Love," and "From Nanny to Heiress, the Convenient Romance of Janet Foster." "Janet?" Betty's small voice made her turn from the window, and she saw both girls standing in the doorway looking frightened and confused. "Why are there so many people outside?" Kirsty asked. "And why did Daddy look so mad when he was talking to the police?" Janet's heart clenched. The twins didn't understand what was happening, only that their peaceful world had suddenly become dangerous and uncertain. "Sometimes," Janet said carefully, kneeling to their level, "people make up stories about families they don't know. It's not nice, but it happens." "Are the stories about us?" Betty asked, her thumb finding its way to her mouth, a stress response that had disappeared months ago but was returning under pressure. "They're made-up stories," Janet assured them, "but they might make things confusing for a while." "Are you still going to marry Daddy?" Kirsty asked, her 6-year-old directness cutting straight to the heart of what Janet had been trying not to think about. "I doubt," Janet began, then stopped, because she honestly didn't know the answer anymore. That evening, after the twins were finally asleep, and the last reporter had been escorted off the property by security, Tom found Janet in the library packing books into boxes with mechanical precision. "What are you doing?" he asked, though the answer was obvious and devastating. "I'm leaving," Janet said without looking up. "I'm going to stay with Roxalana until this is resolved." "Janet, no," Tom said, moving to take the books from her hands. "Running away won't solve anything." "I'm not running away," she replied, finally meeting his eyes. "I'm protecting your family. As long as I'm here, they can use our relationship against you. They can question your judgment, suggest that I'm influencing your decisions about the girls' money, paint me as some kind of manipulative—" "They can say whatever they want," Tom interrupted. "I don't care about their opinions." "You should care," Janet said quietly. "Because if this goes to court, if Child Protective Services decides that the girls aren't safe here, my presence will only make things worse. A judge looking at this situation will see a wealthy widower who moved his children's nanny into his home and then proposed to her 6 months later. They'll see exactly what the newspapers are suggesting, that I seduced you to get access to your money." "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Janet asked, her voice breaking. "Tom, look at this from the outside. Look at what we must seem like to people who don't know us. A grieving millionaire, a working-class nanny, a whirlwind romance that coincides with financial irregularities." "I don't care what it looks like to other people," Tom said firmly. "I care about what it is. And what it is love. Pure, honest, healing love." "Love isn't always enough," Janet whispered, tears starting to slide down her cheeks. "Sometimes love means protecting the people you care about, even if it breaks your heart." Tom stared at her, seeing the pain in her eyes, the way her hands shook as she continued packing. She wasn't leaving because she doubted their love. She was leaving because she loved them too much to let her presence harm his children. "What about the wedding?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Postponed," Janet said, not trusting herself to say cancelled. "Until all of this is resolved, until your family is safe, until—" "Until when?" Tom demanded. "Until some stranger decides we're allowed to love each other? Until society gives us permission to be happy?" "Until your daughters are secure," Janet said firmly. "Tom, if there's even a chance that being with me could result in Kirsty and Betty being taken away from you, then I won't be with you. I can't live with that risk." She moved toward the door, carrying the box of books, but Tom caught her arm gently. "Janet, please," he said, his voice raw with desperation. "We can fight this together. We can prove that the accusations are false, show them that what we have is real." "By the time we prove anything, the damage might already be done," Janet replied. "I won't be the reason your children get hurt. I won't be the weakness they use against you." "You're not a weakness," Tom said fiercely. "You're the strongest person I know. You're the reason my daughters learn to trust again, the reason they remember how to laugh, the reason they believe in happy endings." "Then let me give them one more gift," Janet said, standing on her tiptoes to press a soft kiss to his cheek. "Let me give them the gift of keeping their father safe from people who would use love as a weapon." As she walked away, Tom stood alone in the library where their love story had begun, surrounded by empty shelves and the echo of what might have been. Outside, the photographers were finally gone, but the damage was done. The headlines would continue, the investigation would drag on, and the woman he loved was sacrificing her own happiness to protect his children. For the first time since Eleanora's death, Tom Conway felt completely powerless. He'd built an empire, accumulated wealth beyond measure, commanded respect in boardrooms around the world, but none of it mattered if he couldn't protect the people he loved from those who would destroy them. That night, Tom lay awake in his study, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around him. Somewhere across town, Janet was probably lying awake too, crying into Roxalana's guest room pillows and wondering if she'd made the right choice. 10 days until their wedding. 10 days that now stretched before them like an impossible chasm, filled with lawyers and investigations, and the growing possibility that love might not be enough to overcome the cruelty of those who would destroy it for sport. But as dawn broke gray and uncertain over the Virginia countryside, Tom Conway made a decision that would either save his family or destroy them completely. He was done playing defense. It was time to go on the attack. It was time to remind the world why they called him the most dangerous businessman in Virginia when someone threatened the people he loved. Casimir Aldridge had started this war, but Tom Conway was going to finish it. The shadows were deep and the light seemed far away, but somewhere in the darkness between them, hope was still fighting to survive. And Tom Conway had never lost a fight that mattered this much. Chapter 9. The Gathering Storm. 5 days before what should have been their wedding day, Tom Conway stood on the courthouse steps in Richmond, flanked by enough lawyers to intimidate a small nation, and declared war on everyone who had dared to threaten his family. including the woman he loved, who was standing 50 feet away pretending she didn't know him. "The accusations against me are not just false," Tom said into the cluster of microphones, his voice carrying the cold authority that had made him legendary among Virginia's landed gentry. "They are maliciously fabricated lies designed to destroy my family and prevent my marriage to a woman whose only crime was loving my children enough to heal them." In the crowd, Janet felt her heart stop as Tom's eyes found hers across the sea of reporters and curiosity seekers. He looked magnificent and terrifying, every inch the powerful man who had built an empire from nothing and would burn the world down to protect what mattered to him. "I have spent the last 5 days assembling evidence that will not only prove my innocence," Tom continued, "but will expose the true criminals who orchestrated this attack. By tomorrow evening, you will know exactly who tried to steal from my children and why." The promise in his voice was dark and absolute, and Janet shivered despite the warm September afternoon. She thought leaving him would protect his family, but watching him now, she realized she'd underestimated the lengths Tom Conway would go to when someone threatened the people he loved. After the press conference, Janet hurried to her car, desperate to escape before Tom could corner her for a conversation she wasn't strong enough to have. But as her hand touched the door handle, a familiar voice stopped her cold. "Running away again, Miss Foster." She turned to find Casimir Aldridge standing behind her, his pale eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction and his expensive suit making him look like a predator in gentleman's clothing. "Mr. Aldridge," she said carefully, every instinct screaming danger. "I have to admit, I'm impressed," he continued, moving closer with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Sacrificing your own happiness to protect Conway's reputation. How beautifully tragic." "I don't know what you're talking about," Janet replied, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Of course you don't," Casimir said with a smile that made her skin crawl. "Just like you don't know that all of this could disappear tomorrow. The investigation, the headlines, the threat to those precious little girls, all of it gone with one simple phone call." Despite herself, Janet felt a flicker of hope. "What do you want?" "Nothing too complicated," Casimir replied, his tone conversational. "I want you to convince Conway to sell me his estate holdings at a reasonable price. I want you to disappear from their lives permanently. And I want you to do both of those things before his little press conference tomorrow can do any real damage to my reputation." "And if I refuse?" Casimir's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Then things get much worse for everyone. The financial irregularities become criminal charges. The custody investigation becomes removal proceedings. Conway's estate partners lose confidence, and his holdings crumble. And those 2 little girls spend their formative years in foster care, while their father fights legal battles he can't win." The threat was delivered with such casual cruelty that Janet felt sick. This man would destroy a family, traumatize 2 innocent children just to acquire a business and satisfy his wounded ego. "You're evil," she whispered. "I'm practical," Casimir corrected. "Conway took something from me years ago, a business deal, a woman I wanted, the respect I deserved. Now I'm taking something from him. The only question is whether you're going to help me minimize the collateral damage or force me to destroy everything he loves." Before Janet could respond, a hand closed gently on her shoulder, and she turned to find Tom behind her, his face a mask of cold fury that made Casimir take an involuntary step backward. "I believe," Tom said quietly, "that Ms. Foster has heard enough of your threats." "Conway," Casimir said, trying to recover his composure, "I was just having a friendly conversation with your former fiancé about how you fabricated evidence to frame me for embezzlement," Tom interrupted, his voice carrying deadly calm. About how you've been embezzling from your own charity for 3 years, about how you tried to blackmail the woman I love into convincing me to hand over my company. Casimir's face went white. You can't prove any of that. Actually, said a new voice, he can. They all turned to see Larkin Montague approaching with a briefcase and the satisfied expression of a lawyer who'd just won the case of his career. Casimir Alderidge, Larkin said formally, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and attempted extortion. The FBI will be taking you into custody shortly, but I wanted the pleasure of telling you personally that your little scheme failed spectacularly. As if summoned by his words, federal agents appeared from seemingly nowhere, efficiently and professionally taking Casimir into custody while he sputtered protests and threats that no one was listening to anymore. In the sudden quiet that followed, Tom and Janet stood facing each other on the courthouse steps, separated by 5 days of heartbreak and the careful distance she'd maintained to protect him. It's over, Tom said quietly. All of it. The charges, the investigation, the threats to the girls. Casimir won't be hurting anyone for a very long time. Janet felt tears starting to slide down her cheeks, tears of relief, of joy, of overwhelming gratitude that the nightmare was finally ending. How? She whispered. I may have learned a few things about fighting dirty during my years in business, Tom replied. And I had excellent motivation to win this particular war. Tom, she began, but he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion and pain and desperate love in his gray-blue eyes. You left me, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You left me to protect my family, and I understand why you did it. But Janet, running away from the people who want to hurt us isn't the answer. Fighting back is. I've learned, his voice caught slightly. I've learned that my arrogance, my need to control everything, nearly cost me the most important things in my life. But I've also learned that some things are worth fighting for, even if it means risking everything. I was scared, she admitted. I was terrified that loving you would be what destroyed your family, and I couldn't live with that. The only thing that could destroy my family, Tom said firmly, is losing you. Kirsty and Betty haven't slept through the night since you left. They keep asking when you're coming home, when the wedding is happening, when their almost mama is going to stop being scared and remember that families stick together. The words broke something loose in Janet's chest, some last wall of resistance that had been holding her back from claiming the happiness that was within reach. I missed you, she whispered. I missed you so much I couldn't breathe. Then come home, Tom said, reaching for her hands. Come home and marry me and help me raise our daughters, and never, ever run away from me again. Janet looked into his eyes, the eyes of the man who'd fought heaven and earth to clear her name, who'd taken on federal investigations and media scandals and criminal conspiracies because someone had dared to threaten their love. The wedding, she said. It's supposed to be in 5 days, and I canceled everything. The wedding, Tom interrupted, is happening exactly as planned. Roxalana never canceled anything. Ottilie kept your dress ready, and Ephraim has been coordinating with vendors all week. The only thing missing was the bride. You were that confident I'd come back? I was that confident in us, Tom corrected. I was that sure that love like ours doesn't just disappear because the world gets complicated. Standing on the courthouse steps with the Virginia sunshine warm on her face and the man she loved holding her hands like he'd never let her go again, Janet finally understood what Eleonora had known when she wrote that letter blessing their future. Love wasn't something to be protected from the world. Love was something to be claimed boldly, defended fiercely, and celebrated openly, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. Yes, she said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him while photographers captured the moment for tomorrow's headlines. Yes, I'll come home. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to everything, forever and always. Tom's arms came around her then, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around while she laughed with pure joy, and the crowd of onlookers burst into spontaneous applause. When he finally set her down, both of them breathless and grinning and blazingly happy, Janet looked up at the man who'd just proven that love could conquer anything, even criminal conspiracies and federal investigations and her own terrified heart. 5 days, she said. Do you think that's enough time to plan the wedding of the century? Sweetheart, Tom said, his smile bright enough to power the entire city. I've been planning our forever since the day I found you sleeping with my daughters in my bed. 5 days is just the countdown to the beginning of the rest of our lives. As they walked down the courthouse steps hand in hand, toward the car that would take them home to 2 little girls who were probably watching from the windows and planning their flower girl entrances, Janet felt the last shadows lift from her heart. The storm had passed. The gathering darkness had been defeated by love and determination, and the simple truth that some things were worth fighting for. In 5 days, she would walk down an aisle covered in rose petals toward the man who'd proven that happily ever after wasn't just possible, it was inevitable for those brave enough to claim it. The gathering storm was over. Now it was time for the sunshine. Chapter 10, Forever Begins. On the morning of her wedding day, Janet Conway-to-be woke before dawn in the master bedroom that had once been forbidden territory and was now filled with white roses, morning sunlight, and the joyful chaos of 2 6-year-old flower girls who had appointed themselves her personal wedding preparation committee. Janet! Janet! Wake up! Betty bounced on the massive bed with the enthusiasm of someone who had been awake since 5 a.m. planning the most important day in their family's history. It's wedding day. We checked, Kirsty added with serious precision. The sun is up, the flowers are ready, and Daddy has been awake for 2 hours making sure everything is perfect for you. Janet sat up in the bed that had witnessed so much of their love story and felt her heart overflow with gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Are you excited? Betty asked, settling beside her with the serious expression of a child conducting important research. I'm more than excited, Janet replied honestly. I'm so happy I feel like I might burst into sparkles. Good, Kirsty said with satisfaction. Because Daddy looks like that too. 3 hours later, the Conway estate had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. White roses and fairy lights adorned every surface, and chairs draped in ivory silk created an aisle that led to the garden pavilion where Tom and Janet would promise each other forever. In the bridal suite, Janet stood before the mirror, while Roxalana Ashbourne and Ottilie Ravensdale made final adjustments to the dress that made her look like a Renaissance angel. Perfect, Ottilie declared. Absolutely perfect. Janet turned to look at herself one final time, hardly recognizing the radiant woman in the mirror. The ivory silk flowed like water, Eleanora's antique veil caught the light like captured starlight, and the sapphire engagement ring seemed to hold all the promises of their future. Nervous? Roxalana asked gently. No, Janet said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I'm ready. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and Ephraim Whitmore's distinguished voice called through the wood. Ladies, it's time. Outside, the September afternoon was perfect. As Janet made her way to the garden, she could hear the string quartet and see their guests rising in anticipation. But when she reached the beginning of the rose-petal-strewn aisle, everything else faded except the man waiting for her at the pavilion. Tom stood beneath an arch of white roses and fairy lights, wearing a charcoal-gray suit that made his eyes look like storm clouds and his smile like sunshine. When he saw her, his face lit up with pure, overwhelming love. Ready, Janet? Ephraim asked gently, offering her his arm. "Ready," she replied, her eyes never leaving Tom's face. The procession began with Kirsty and Betty, both wearing white dresses with rose-colored sashes and carrying baskets of rose petals that they scattered with serious concentration. They looked like tiny angels. Then came Janet, walking slowly down the aisle, her entire focus on Tom's face, the way his eyes filled with tears when he saw her, the way his smile grew brighter with every step. When she finally reached him, when Ephraim placed her hand in Tom's, the world narrowed to just the two of them. "Hi," Tom whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Hi," Janet whispered back, her heart so full of love she could barely speak. Dr. Sophrona Beauchamp began the ceremony with words about love and commitment, but Janet was lost in Tom's eyes, in the absolute rightness of this moment. "Tom and Janet have chosen to write their own vows," Dr. Beauchamp announced. Tom went first, his hands trembling slightly as he looked into Janet's eyes. "Janet," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the garden, "6 months ago, you walked into my broken family and gave us back our lives. You taught my daughters that love doesn't always end in loss. You showed me that healing was possible." His voice broke slightly and he paused while Janet squeezed his hands encouragingly. "I promise to cherish every morning I wake up beside you, every evening we spend with our daughters, every ordinary moment that makes up an extraordinary life. I promise to choose you every day, in every storm, for all the days of my life. And Janet, I promise to never again let fear make decisions for our family. Whatever comes, we face it together." By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Janet took a shaky breath and began her own vows. "Tom," she said, her hands steady in his, "you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, the belief that love could heal instead of hurt. You showed me that some risks are worth everything. I promise to love you with fierce devotion. I promise to love Kirsty and Betty as my own daughters, to protect them and guide them and help them grow into extraordinary women. I promise to choose courage over fear, love over safety, us over anything the world tries to put between us. And Tom, I promise to never run away from you again. Whatever storms come, we weather them together." Dr. Beauchamp was about to pronounce them husband and wife when Kirsty stepped forward with the serious expression of a child who had something very important to say. "Wait," she announced, "Janet has to promise to be our mama too." The unplanned interruption was perfect, a reminder that this wedding was creating a family. Janet knelt down to Kirsty and Betty's level, taking their small hands in hers. "Kirsty and Betty Conway," she said solemnly, "I promise to be your mama in every way that matters. I promise to love you, protect you, and celebrate every single day of your beautiful lives." "Do you promise to make pancakes on Sundays?" Betty asked seriously. "I promise to make pancakes on Sundays," Janet agreed with a laugh. "Do you promise to love Daddy forever and ever?" they asked together. "I promise to love Daddy forever and ever," Janet said, looking up at Tom with eyes bright with tears and joy. "Good," Kirsty said with satisfaction. "Now you can get married." "By the power vested in me," Dr. Beauchamp said with a radiant smile, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Tom, you may kiss your bride." Tom's hands came up to frame Janet's face, his thumbs wiping away her tears of joy. "Hello, Mrs. Conway," he whispered. "Hello, Mr. Conway," she whispered back. And then he kissed her, soft and perfect, while their guests cheered and rose petals fell like blessings, and two little girls bounced with excitement. When they finally broke apart, Tom and Janet turned to face their family and friends as husband and wife, with Kirsty and Betty racing to hug them in a tangle of white dresses and pure joy. "We did it," Tom murmured against Janet's ear. "We're really married." "We're really a family," Janet corrected. The reception was filled with dancing and laughter and toasts that made everyone cry happy tears. Tom and Janet's first dance was to At Last by Etta James, and when Tom spun Janet around the dance floor, even the most cynical guests had to admit they were witnessing something magical. But the moment that would live in everyone's memory came during the father-daughter dance, when Tom called Janet and Kirsty to join him and Betty on the dance floor. "This is a family dance," he announced, "because that's what we are now, a family." As they swayed together to Beautiful Boy by John Lennon, Tom with one daughter in his arms and Janet with the other, they looked like the very definition of happily ever after. Later that night, after the last guest had gone home and the twins were finally asleep, Tom and Janet stood in the garden pavilion where so much of their love story had unfolded. Janet was still wearing her wedding dress, and Tom had loosened his tie. "So," Tom said, pulling her into his arms, "how does it feel to be Mrs. Conway?" "Perfect," Janet replied without hesitation. "It feels absolutely perfect." They swayed together in the moonlight, no music except the night sounds of their estate. "I love you, Janet Conway," Tom murmured against her hair. "I love you too, Tom Conway," she replied, "and I love our daughters and our life, and this beautiful story we get to keep writing together." "Speaking of stories," Tom said with a smile that made her heart skip, "I have one more surprise." He pulled a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket, and when Janet opened it, she found a leather-bound journal with their wedding date embossed on the cover. "For recording all our adventures," he explained, "starting with today and going on for the next 50 years or so." Janet opened the journal to find that Tom had already written on the first page, September 15th, the day Janet Foster became Janet Conway and turned our house into a home, our healing into wholeness, our family into forever. "Today was perfect," Janet said, closing the journal and holding it close to her heart. "But you know what the best part was?" "What?" "Knowing that it's just the beginning," she said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him under the stars. "Knowing that we get to wake up tomorrow and choose each other all over again." "Every day," Tom agreed, his arms tightening around her. "For the rest of our lives." As they walked back to the house, hand in hand, toward the master bedroom they would now share, toward the future they would build together, Janet felt the last piece of her heart click into place. She had found her forever. She had found her family. She had found her home. And in a house filled with sleeping children and fairy lights and the lingering scent of roses, Mr. and Mrs. Conway began the rest of their beautiful love story. Forever had finally begun. The end.